After 40 years as a high court judge, I hosted my retirement dinner. Just before the toast, I saw my ambitious nephew slip a white pill into my red wine. I pretended to drop my fork and swapped the goblets. 5 minutes later, he stood up to speak and, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow this story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I never thought my retirement dinner would become the night I discovered who my nephew really was. After 40 years on the bench, I had seen every kind of betrayal, every form of deception that human beings could devise. But nothing had prepared me for what I witnessed in those few seconds at Le Bernardin that Thursday evening. The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversation and the gentle clink of crystal glasses. 68 guests had gathered to celebrate my 4 decades as a judge in the county courthouse. Colleagues, fellow attorneys, court clerks, and family members filled the elegant dining room. Candles flickered on each table, casting warm shadows across the mahogany paneling that reminded me so much of my own library at home. I stood near the bar, accepting congratulations and well wishes, my hand instinctively touching the gold ring on my finger, the same graduation ring I had worn for 40 years. The weight of it felt heavier tonight, as if it carried the significance of everything I was leaving behind. "Uncle Edwin, you look distinguished as always." Floyd appeared beside me, his smile bright and confident. At 42, he had inherited his mother's sharp cheekbones and quick wit, but there was something in his eyes tonight that I couldn't quite place. Something restless. "Thank you for organizing all this, Floyd," I said, gesturing toward the beautifully arranged tables. "Margaret would have been proud to see how you've grown." His expression flickered for just a moment at the mention of his mother, my sister, who had passed away 30 years ago in that terrible car accident. Floyd had been only 12 then, a frightened boy who came to live with me because there was no one else. I had never married, never had children of my own, so raising him became the most important thing I had ever done. "She would have wanted you to have a proper send-off," Floyd said, adjusting his expensive tie. I noticed he was wearing the watch I had given him when he passed the bar exam, a Rolex worth $8,000. "After everything you've done for this community, for me, you deserve recognition." The sincerity in his voice warmed me, and I felt that familiar surge of paternal pride. This was the boy I had tutored through high school mathematics, the young man I had guided through law school, paying his monthly tuition of $3,200 without ever making him feel like a burden. Floyd had become everything I had hoped. A successful attorney with his own practice, a lovely wife named Victoria, a beautiful home in the suburbs. "Judge Patterson, congratulations on your retirement." Sarah Chen, my longtime court assistant, approached with a warm smile. 40 years of service to justice. That's something to be truly proud of. "Thank you, Sarah. I couldn't have done it without dedicated people like you," I replied, meaning every word. Sarah had worked with me for 15 years, and her loyalty and competence had made even the most difficult cases manageable. "I need to check on the dinner arrangements," Floyd said, excusing himself with another smile. I watched him walk toward our table where the place cards were arranged with military precision. He had always been detail-oriented, even as a child. I remembered helping him organize his school projects, watching him line up his pencils and notebooks with the same careful attention he now applied to his legal briefs. The evening progressed beautifully. Speeches were made, stories were shared, and I found myself genuinely moved by the outpouring of respect and affection from people whose lives had intersected with mine over the decades. Judge Harrison, my old mentor who was now 87, stood and spoke about the importance of integrity in the judicial system, his voice still strong despite his age. As we moved to our assigned seats for dinner, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was how a career should end, surrounded by people who valued your contributions, who understood the weight of the decisions you had made, the responsibility you had carried. Floyd held out my chair for me, a gesture of respect that reminded me of the manners I had taught him as a teenager. "I took the liberty of ordering your favorite wine," he said, indicating the deep red liquid in the crystal glass beside my plate. "The 1987 Bordeaux from the case you've been saving for special occasions." I was touched by his thoughtfulness. That wine had been a gift from a grateful attorney 20 years ago, after I had ruled fairly in a particularly contentious divorce case. I had been saving it indeed, waiting for the right moment to open it. "That's very considerate of you," I said, settling into my chair. The familiar comfort of routine surrounded me, the weight of my suit jacket, the texture of the starched napkin, the soft murmur of conversation from the surrounding tables. Floyd took his seat to my right, Victoria beside him. She looked elegant as always, her dark hair pulled back in a sophisticated chignon, her emerald dress complementing her olive skin. They made a handsome couple, and I had often thought how proud Margaret would have been to see her son so well settled. "Uncle Edwin," Victoria said, reaching across to squeeze my hand. "Floyd has told me so many stories about growing up in your house. How you helped him with his homework every night, how you attended every school function." "He was easy to help," I replied, looking at Floyd with affection. "Always eager to learn, always asking the right questions." But as I reached for my wine glass, something caught my eye that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. Floyd was glancing around the table nervously, his fingers drumming against the white tablecloth. When he thought no one was looking, he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something small, a tiny white object that he palmed expertly. My years of observing human behavior in the courtroom had trained me to notice details others might miss, and what I saw made my heart pound with a rhythm I had never experienced before. With movements so quick they were almost invisible, Floyd leaned slightly toward my wine glass and dropped whatever he was holding into the dark red liquid. It dissolved instantly, leaving no trace except for a brief fizzing that could easily have been mistaken for the wine's natural carbonation. Time seemed to stop. The conversations around me became muffled as if I were underwater. The candlelight wavered, and I felt a strange disconnection from my own body, as if I were watching this scene unfold from somewhere else entirely. The boy I had raised, the nephew I had loved like a son, had just contaminated my drink with something. The implications crashed over me in waves, each one more devastating than the last. This wasn't a prank or an accident. The careful way he had checked to ensure no one was watching, the precise timing, the practiced motion, this was planned. Floyd straightened up, adjusting his cufflinks with casual confidence, and turned to smile at me. "Shall we toast to your retirement, Uncle Edwin? To the end of one chapter and the beginning of another?" I stared at him. This man I thought I knew better than anyone else in the world. The face that had looked up at me with trust when he was 12. The young man who had hugged me tearfully when he passed the bar exam. The nephew who called me every Sunday to check on my health and ask about my week. "Yes," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "A toast sounds perfect." My hand trembled slightly as I reached for my glass, but I caught myself before Floyd could notice. 40 years of maintaining composure on the bench served me well in this moment. I had learned to keep my expression neutral even when hearing the most shocking testimony, even when facing the most difficult decisions. But inside, my world was crumbling. The trust that had been the foundation of our relationship for 30 years was dissolving as quickly as whatever substance Floyd had placed in my wine. I needed time to think, to understand what was happening and why. Most importantly, I needed to figure out what to do next. Because if Floyd was capable of this, whatever this was, then everything I thought I knew about him was a lie. As I sat there holding my tampered wine glass, my mind raced backward through the months leading up to this moment. How had I missed the signs? How had a man who had spent 4 decades reading people, interpreting their motivations and detecting their deceptions, failed to see what was happening in his own family? The first warning should have been Floyd's sudden interest in my estate planning. 3 months ago, he had brought up the subject during one of our regular Sunday dinners at my house in Richmond Hill. We were sitting in my library, surrounded by the floor-to-ceiling shelves of law books and case studies that had been my constant companions for so many years. "Uncle Edwin," he had said, setting down his coffee cup on the mahogany side table, "have you given any thought to updating your will recently?" I remember being slightly surprised by the question. "My will is current, Floyd. Why do you ask?" "Well, tax laws change. Estate planning strategies evolve," he had replied, his tone casual but his eyes sharp with something I now recognized as calculation. "I just want to make sure you're taking advantage of all available options. You've worked so hard to build what you have. It would be a shame if poor planning meant losing a significant portion to unnecessary taxes. At the time, his concern had seemed natural, even touching. Here was my nephew, a successful attorney in his own right, wanting to ensure that my life's work would be preserved and properly distributed. I had felt grateful for his attention to such matters. "I appreciate your concern," I had told him that evening, "but my attorney handles those details. Everything is properly structured." Floyd had nodded, but I noticed he had pressed further. Of course. I just thought, given my background in estate law, maybe I could review everything, just to give you peace of mind." I should have wondered why he was so eager to examine my financial affairs. Instead, I had been pleased by his initiative, interpreting it as evidence of his maturity and professional competence. The second sign had come 6 weeks later. Floyd had visited my chambers at the courthouse, something he rarely did. He sat in the leather chair across from my desk, the same chair where countless attorneys had presented their cases over the years. "Uncle Edwin, I've been thinking about your retirement plans," he had said, leaning forward with apparent earnestness. "You've been working for 4 decades. Don't you think it's time to step back and enjoy the fruits of your labor?" "I am retiring, Floyd. The dinner next month is my farewell celebration, remember?" "Yes, but I mean really stepping back, traveling, relaxing, maybe moving somewhere more convenient for your daily needs. This house is quite large for one person, and maintaining it must be expensive." His suggestion that I sell the house had struck me as odd. The Victorian mansion on Richmond Hill had been my home for 35 years. Every room held memories. Every piece of furniture had been carefully chosen. The idea of leaving it had never occurred to me. "I love that house, Floyd. It's where you grew up, where we shared so many important moments. Why would I want to leave it?" Floyd had shifted in his chair, and for just a moment his mask of concern had slipped. I caught a glimpse of impatience, maybe even frustration, before he composed himself again. "I just want to make sure you're not burdening yourself unnecessarily," he had said. "A smaller place might be easier to manage, more practical for someone your age." Someone your age. The phrase had stung, though I hadn't acknowledged it at the time. At 62, I felt healthy and vital. The idea that I needed to downsize my life because of my age seemed premature, almost insulting. Now, sitting at this dinner table with my contaminated wine glass before me, I realized Floyd had been assessing my assets, calculating their value, planning for their transfer. The house worth $750,000, the investment portfolio I had built over decades of careful saving, the pension that would continue for Victoria after my passing. He had been taking inventory. The third sign had been the most disturbing, though I had dismissed it at the time. 2 weeks ago, Floyd had come to dinner with an unusual request. He wanted to borrow against his inheritance. "I have an investment opportunity," he had explained as we sat at my dining room table. "A real estate development that could triple the initial investment within 2 years. But I need capital quickly, and my liquid assets are tied up in the practice." "What kind of investment requires such urgency?" I had asked. Floyd's explanation had been vague, filled with terms like time-sensitive opportunity and exclusive access. When I pressed for details, he had become evasive, almost defensive. "I understand you need to be careful, Uncle Edwin. Your judicial training makes you naturally skeptical. But this is a sure thing, and the returns would benefit both of us in the long run." When I had declined to provide the money, suggesting instead that he wait and use traditional financing, Floyd's reaction had been telling. The disappointment in his eyes was sharp, almost bitter. For a moment, he had looked at me as if I were an obstacle to be overcome rather than a family member who cared about his well-being. "Of course," he had said, recovering quickly. "You're right to be cautious. I'll find another way." But I could see the wheels turning in his mind, and now I understood what he had been planning. The fourth and most damning sign had come just last week. Victoria had called me, her voice strained with worry. "Uncle Edwin, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't think I'm betraying Floyd's confidence." "What is it, dear?" "He's been acting strangely lately, staying up late, making phone calls he won't discuss, researching things on his computer that he quickly closes when I walk into the room." My heart had clenched with concern. "Have you asked him about it?" "I tried, but he says it's just work pressure." "But Edwin, I found some papers on his desk, printed articles about medical conditions, treatments, things that could affect elderly people. At the time, I had assumed Floyd might be worried about my health, perhaps researching ways to help me age more gracefully. Now I realized he had been researching something entirely different. I'm probably being paranoid, Victoria had continued, but some of the articles were about medications, interactions, things that could cause problems for someone your age. I had reassured her that Floyd was probably just being overly cautious about my well-being, but her call had planted a seed of unease that I had tried to ignore. Now, as I sat at this elegant table surrounded by people celebrating my career, that seed had grown into a terrible understanding. Floyd hadn't been researching ways to protect my health. He had been researching ways to compromise it. The boy I had raised from age 12, who had slept in the bedroom down the hall from mine for 6 years, who had sat at my kitchen table doing homework while I prepared dinner. This boy had grown into a man capable of something I couldn't even name. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made for him, the vacations I hadn't taken so I could pay his college tuition of $3,200 every month for 4 years, the social events I had skipped to attend his school plays and soccer games, the relationships I had let fade because raising Floyd had become my primary focus. I had given him everything: love, guidance, opportunity, financial support. I had shared my knowledge, my connections, my home. I had been proud when he chose to study law, thrilled when he passed the bar exam, overjoyed when he started his own practice. And this was how he repaid that devotion. The waiter approached our table, beginning to serve the first course, and I realized I had to make a decision. I could confront Floyd here, in front of everyone, creating a scene that would destroy not only him but also the memory of this evening that was meant to celebrate my career. Or I could find another way to handle this situation, a way that would give me time to understand the full extent of his betrayal and plan my response accordingly. I looked at Floyd, who was smiling and chatting with the guests at our table, playing the role of the loving nephew perfectly. His performance was flawless, just as it had been for months while he planned whatever he had put in my wine. But I had learned something in 40 years on the bench that Floyd had apparently forgotten. Justice doesn't always come swiftly, but it always comes eventually. And tonight, it was going to come for him. The weight of knowledge sat heavy in my chest as I contemplated my next move. Around me, the dinner continued with its elegant rhythm. Guests laughing, waiters serving the first course, crystal glasses catching the warm candlelight. But my world had narrowed to the contaminated wine glass sitting inches from my hand, and the nephew who had just revealed his true nature. Floyd was engaged in animated conversation with Judge Harrison about recent changes in corporate law, his voice confident and professional. To anyone watching, he appeared to be the perfect nephew, attentive, successful, devoted. But I could see through the performance now, and what I saw chilled me to the bone. I needed to act, but I also needed to be smart about it. 40 years on the bench had taught me that hasty decisions often led to regrettable consequences. This situation required the same careful consideration I had applied to the most complex legal cases. "Uncle Edwin, you seem quiet tonight," Victoria observed, her dark eyes filled with genuine concern. "Are you feeling all right?" The irony of her question wasn't lost on me. Here was Floyd's wife worried about my well-being, while her husband sat beside her having just tampered with my drink. Did she know? Was she part of this? Or was she as deceived as I had been? "Just reflecting on the evening," I replied, managing a smile. 40 years of memories tend to flood back at moments like this. Floyd glanced at me and I caught something in his expression. Anticipation, maybe even excitement. He was waiting for me to drink the wine, waiting to see the results of whatever he had put in it. The realization made my stomach turn, but I kept my face carefully neutral. "You should try the wine, Uncle Edwin," Floyd said, raising his own glass. "It's really exceptional, perfect for toasting such a momentous occasion." His insistence confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't paranoia or misunderstanding. Floyd genuinely wanted me to consume whatever he had put in that glass. "You're right," I said, reaching for the wine. "A toast is definitely in order." But as my hand moved toward my glass, I deliberately knocked my fork to the floor. The silver utensil clattered against the hardwood, drawing the attention of everyone at our table. How clumsy of me, I said, bending down to retrieve the fork. In that moment, hidden beneath the white tablecloth, I executed a maneuver that would have impressed any magician. With movements honed by decades of handling evidence in courtrooms, I switched my contaminated wine glass with Floyd's clean one. The exchange took less than 3 seconds, invisible to everyone above the table. When I straightened up, fork in hand, my heart was pounding but my expression remained calm. Years of maintaining judicial composure under pressure served me well. I had learned to hide my reactions when hearing shocking testimony, when facing attempts at intimidation, when making decisions that would alter people's lives forever. I should ask for a clean fork, I said to the waiter, who immediately provided one. Floyd was watching me with barely concealed impatience. Now about that toast, he said, lifting what he believed was his own glass but was actually mine, the one that had originally contained whatever substance he had added. Absolutely, I replied, raising what had been his glass, the clean one. The twisted justice of the situation wasn't lost on me. For 30 years I had taught Floyd about right and wrong, about consequences and accountability. Now he was about to learn those lessons in the most direct way possible. To Judge Edwin Harrison, Floyd announced, standing and holding his glass high. His voice carried across our section of the restaurant, drawing smiles and attention from nearby tables. A man who has dedicated his life to justice, who raised me when I had nowhere else to turn, who showed me the meaning of integrity and honor. The words sounded beautiful, heartfelt even. If I hadn't just witnessed his betrayal, I might have been moved to tears. Instead, I felt sick listening to him speak about integrity while holding a glass that contained evidence of his complete lack of it. Uncle Edwin taught me that every action has consequences, Floyd continued, his eyes meeting mine. That we must be prepared to face the results of our choices, good or bad. The irony of his words was almost unbearable. He was about to experience exactly what he had just described, though not in the way he expected. He showed me that family is the most important thing in life, Floyd went on, his voice growing more emotional. That love and loyalty should guide our decisions, and that we should always protect those we care about. Several guests were dabbing at their eyes now, touched by what they perceived as a nephew's heartfelt tribute to his beloved uncle. If only they knew the truth. So here's to you, Uncle Edwin, Floyd said, raising his glass higher. Thank you for everything you've given me. Thank you for making me the man I am today. The applause that followed was warm and sincere. Guests raised their glasses in solidarity, creating a beautiful tableau of respect and affection. I stood as well, holding my clean glass, and nodded acknowledgement to the room. Thank you all, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my heart. Your words mean more to me than you could know. Floyd smiled at me with what appeared to be genuine love, then brought his glass, the contaminated one, to his lips and drank deeply. I watched in fascination as he consumed a significant portion of the wine, apparently savoring its taste. Excellent choice, he said to me, setting the glass down. This vintage is truly special. Yes, I agreed, taking a small sip from my own clean glass. It certainly is. The dinner continued around us. The first course was served, a delicate seafood appetizer that I could barely taste. My attention was entirely focused on Floyd, watching for any signs that whatever he had put in the wine was beginning to affect him. Initially, nothing seemed different. Floyd continued his conversations, charming the other guests with stories about his legal practice and asking thoughtful questions about their own careers. He was performing his role perfectly, just as he had been performing the role of loving nephew for who knows how long. But as the minutes passed, I began to notice subtle changes. Floyd's speech became slightly less precise. His gestures grew more expansive, less controlled. When he reached for his water glass, his hand trembled almost imperceptibly. Are you feeling all right, darling? Victoria asked, placing her hand on his arm with obvious concern. Fine, Floyd replied, but his voice was softer now, less confident. Just excited about the evening. I continued to watch him, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Part of me was satisfied to see justice beginning to unfold. But another part, the part that remembered the 12-year-old boy who had cried in my arms after his parents' funeral. Felt a deep sadness at what Floyd had become. 20 minutes after the toast, Floyd excused himself to use the restroom. I watched him walk across the restaurant, noting the slight unsteadiness in his gait that wasn't quite noticeable, unless you knew what to look for. When he returned 5 minutes later, his face was pale, and there was a sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the restaurant. "Floyd, you don't look well," Judge Harrison observed with the sharp eyes of a man who had spent decades reading people. "I think I might have had too much to drink," Floyd said, attempting a laugh that came out forced and hollow. "The excitement of the evening, I suppose." But I could see the confusion in his eyes, the growing realization that something was very wrong. He looked at his wine glass, then at me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of understanding cross his features. "Uncle Edwin," he said slowly, his voice taking on an edge of suspicion, "didn't you drop your fork earlier?" "Yes," I replied calmly, meeting his gaze directly. "Clumsy of me, wasn't it?" Floyd stared at me for a long moment, and I could see his mind working, trying to piece together what had happened. His eyes moved from his glass to mine, then back again. The color drained from his face as the implications began to dawn on him. "I think," he said carefully, gripping the edge of the table, "I think I need some fresh air." "Of course," Victoria said, immediately standing to help him. "Let me come with you." "No," Floyd said sharply, then softened his tone. "No, I just need a moment alone." As he made his way toward the restaurant's entrance, moving with increasing difficulty, I felt the weight of 4 decades of judicial experience settling over me. I had just witnessed justice in its purest form, a man facing the exact consequences he had intended for someone else. What happened next unfolded like a slow-motion disaster that I could see coming but felt powerless to prevent. Floyd had been outside for nearly 15 minutes when Victoria began to show real concern. "I should check on him," she said, rising from her chair with obvious worry. "He's never been one to get sick from wine." "Perhaps we should all step outside for some air," Judge Harrison suggested, his weathered face creased with concern. "The evening has been quite emotional." Before anyone could respond, Floyd appeared in the doorway of the restaurant. The transformation in his appearance was startling. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive tie was loosened, and his face had taken on a grayish pallor that made him look far older than his 42 years. He moved slowly back to our table, one hand trailing along the wall for support. Several diners from other tables glanced up with curiosity, sensing that something was amiss. "Floyd, my God, what happened?" Victoria jumped up to help him, her voice tight with alarm. "I'm fine," he said, but his words were slightly slurred now, and the tremor in his hands was becoming more pronounced. "Just need to sit down for a moment." As he lowered himself into his chair, I could see the confusion and growing panic in his eyes. Whatever he had put in my wine was affecting him far more severely than he had anticipated. The irony wasn't lost on me. Floyd had miscalculated the dosage, perhaps assuming that my age would make me more vulnerable to whatever substance he had chosen. "Should I call a doctor?" Sarah Chen asked from across the table, her natural concern for others overriding any confusion about the situation. "No, no," Floyd said quickly, too quickly. "I just need water." But even as he reached for his water glass, his coordination failed him. The glass slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered against his dinner plate, sending crystal shards across the white tablecloth. The sound drew attention from every table in our section of the restaurant. A collective gasp arose from our guests. Victoria immediately knelt beside Floyd's chair, her dark eyes wide with fear. "Darling, you're scaring me. Tell me what's wrong." For a moment, Floyd's gaze met mine across the table. In his eyes, I saw the full realization of what had occurred. He understood that I had discovered his plan and turned it back on him. But more than that, I could see the dawning comprehension that whatever he had intended for me was now coursing through his own system. "Uncle Edwin," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the concerned murmur of voices around us. "I need to talk to you. Alone." The desperation in his tone was unmistakable. Here was a man who had just realized that his carefully laid plan had backfired spectacularly. and who was beginning to face consequences he had never imagined for himself. "I think you should focus on feeling better first," I replied calmly, though my heart was racing with adrenaline. "Perhaps some fresh air would help?" Floyd tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him properly. He gripped the table's edge, his knuckles white with the effort of remaining upright. "Something's wrong," he said, no longer trying to hide his distress. "Something's very wrong." Judge Harrison, with his decades of experience reading people and situations, leaned forward with sharp attention. "Floyd, you mentioned earlier that you might have had too much to drink, but this seems like something more serious. Are you taking any medications that might interact with alcohol?" The question hit Floyd like a physical blow. His face went even paler, and I could see him struggling to find an answer that wouldn't reveal the truth. He began, then stopped. His breathing was becoming labored, and small beads of sweat were forming on his forehead, despite the comfortable temperature in the restaurant. Victoria placed her hand on his arm, her concern deepening. "Floyd, you're frightening me. Please let someone call for medical help." "No!" The word came out sharper than Floyd intended, drawing even more attention from nearby tables. Restaurant staff were beginning to hover nervously at the edges of our section, clearly uncertain about how to handle the situation. I watched all of this unfold with a mixture of fascination and deep sadness. This wasn't how I had wanted the evening to end. Part of me had hoped that confronting Floyd privately might have led to a confession, perhaps even to understanding why he had chosen this path. Instead, his plan had collapsed publicly, in front of 68 people who had gathered to celebrate my career. "Floyd," I said quietly, leaning toward him, "perhaps you should tell us exactly what you think might be causing this reaction. It might help if medical professionals know what they're dealing with." His eyes widened at the implication of my words. I was offering him a chance to confess, to explain what he had put in the wine so that appropriate help could be provided. But confession would mean admitting to everyone present what he had attempted to do to me. I can't. Floyd struggled with the words, his moral cowardice warring with his growing physical distress. That's when Judge Harrison demonstrated why he had been such a respected jurist for over 50 years. With the sharp instincts that had made him legendary in the legal community, he looked from Floyd to me, then back to Floyd, and I could see understanding dawning in his wise old eyes. "Young man," Judge Harrison said in the authoritative tone that had commanded respect in courtrooms for decades, "I suggest you tell us immediately what substance you've ingested, because your condition appears to be deteriorating rapidly." The directness of the question coming from such a respected figure seemed to break something inside Floyd. His carefully constructed facade finally crumbled completely. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. "It was supposed to be. It wasn't supposed to affect me." A shocked silence fell over our table. Victoria stared at her husband with growing horror, beginning to piece together the implications of his words. "What wasn't supposed to affect you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Floyd looked around the table at all the faces staring at him, people who had known him for years, who had watched him grow up, who had celebrated his achievements and considered him family. The weight of their scrutiny seemed to crush him. "The wine," he finally admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I put something in Uncle Edwin's wine, but he switched the glasses when he dropped his fork. I drank it instead." The collective intake of breath from our table was audible even over the restaurant's ambient noise. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth, her face going pale with shock. Sarah Chen sat back in her chair as if she'd been struck. Judge Harrison's expression hardened into the stern mask he had worn when pronouncing sentences on convicted criminals. "You did what?" Victoria's voice was high and strained, hardly recognizable. But before Floyd could answer, his condition worsened dramatically. His breathing became rapid and shallow. His hands began to shake uncontrollably and his eyes lost their focus. "Call 911, Judge Harrison commanded with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed immediately. As chaos erupted around our table, Victoria crying, guests pulling out their phones, restaurant staff rushing to help, I found myself strangely calm. After 40 years of dealing with crises in the courtroom, I had learned to remain steady when others panicked, but as I watched Floyd struggling with the consequences of his own actions, I felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Instead, I felt the profound sadness of a man who had just watched someone he loved destroy himself. The boy I had raised, the nephew I had cherished, had revealed himself to be someone I didn't recognize. And now he was facing the exact fate he had planned for me, learning too late that some actions can never be undone. The hospital waiting room felt sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the warm elegance of Le Bernardin, where this nightmare had begun just 4 hours earlier. I sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, still wearing my retirement dinner suit, watching the controlled chaos of Mount Sinai's emergency department through glass doors that swooshed open and closed with mechanical precision. Victoria sat across from me, her elegant emerald dress now wrinkled and stained with tears. She hadn't spoken to me directly since Floyd's confession at the restaurant, but I could feel her staring at me with a mixture of confusion, anger, and desperate need for answers. Judge Harrison had insisted on coming with us, his 87-year-old frame moving with surprising agility as he navigated the hospital corridors. Sarah Chen had stayed behind to explain the situation to our dinner guests and handle the aftermath of what would undoubtedly become the most talked-about retirement party in the county's legal community. The paramedics had arrived within 8 minutes of our call, professional and efficient as they assessed Floyd's condition. I had watched them work, answering their questions about his symptoms with clinical detachment, while inside I wrestled with emotions I couldn't fully identify. "Mr. Holloway?" A young doctor in blue scrubs emerged from the treatment area, clipboard in hand. Dr. Martinez, according to his name tag, looked tired but alert. "Your nephew is stable now. We've administered treatment to counteract the substance in his system." Victoria jumped up immediately. "Can I see him?" "In a few minutes. We need to keep monitoring him, but the worst has passed." Dr. Martinez turned to me. "The police would like to speak with you about what happened." I nodded, having expected this. "Of course." Detective Roberts was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had the kind of direct manner that came from years of dealing with people in crisis. "Judge Holloway, I understand there was an incident this evening involving your nephew and some kind of substance added to alcoholic beverages." "That's correct," I replied, settling into the conference room chair she had indicated. "Floyd admitted to tampering with my wine glass. When I accidentally switched our glasses, he consumed whatever he had put in mine." Detective Roberts made notes as I spoke. "Do you have any idea what substance he used?" "No, though I assume the hospital tests will reveal that information." "They will. What I'm trying to understand is the sequence of events. You say you accidentally switched glasses?" I paused, weighing my words carefully. 40 years of legal experience had taught me the importance of precision in testimony. I dropped my fork and bent down to retrieve it. During that time, our glasses were switched. Whether it was accidental or intentional is difficult to determine. The detective studied my face for a long moment. "Judge Holloway, given your legal background, I'm sure you understand that if this was intentional retaliation, it could constitute a crime." "I understand the law, Detective. I also understand that a man who tampers with someone else's drink bears responsibility for the consequences of that action, regardless of who ultimately consumes the substance." She nodded slowly. "We'll need a full statement from you, and we'll be investigating the incident thoroughly. Your nephew could face serious charges for what he attempted." After giving my statement, I returned to the waiting room to find Victoria pacing near the windows. The mascara that had run down her cheeks earlier had been cleaned away, but her eyes were red and swollen from crying. "They're letting me see him now," she said without looking at me. "The doctor says he'll recover completely, but it will take time." "I'm glad to hear that," I said, meaning it despite everything that had happened. Victoria turned to face me then, her expression a mixture of pain and accusation. "How could you do this to him, Edwin? How could you let him drink something that dangerous?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Even after Floyd's public confession, she was finding a way to make me responsible for his suffering. "Victoria," I said gently, "Floyd put that substance in my drink, intending for me to consume it. He made that choice. He bears the responsibility for what happened. But you knew, she said, her voice rising. You knew and you let him drink it anyway. Judge Harrison, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up with the authority that had made him legendary in legal circles. Young lady, I suggest you direct your anger where it belongs. Your husband attempted something unthinkable tonight. Victoria's face crumpled. I don't understand any of this. Floyd loves Edwin. He's always talked about how grateful he is for everything Edwin did for him. Why would he? Why would he try to hurt him? That was the question I had been asking myself since the moment I witnessed Floyd tampering with my wine. Why had the boy I raised, the young man I loved like a son, chosen to betray me in such a fundamental way? I think, Judge Harrison said quietly, that's a question only Floyd can answer. 20 minutes later, a nurse led us to Floyd's room. He was awake, propped up against white pillows, with an IV line running into his left arm. The confident, charismatic attorney from the dinner party was gone, replaced by someone who looked fragile and defeated. Uncle Edwin, he said when he saw me, his voice hoarse from the medical procedures. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I pulled a chair close to his bed, noting how Victoria remained standing near the door, as if she couldn't decide whether to comfort her husband or maintain distance from him. Floyd, I need you to help me understand something, I said, leaning forward. Why? What drove you to do this? He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with tears. The practice is failing, Uncle Edwin. I'm drowning in debt. Victoria doesn't know how bad it is. I've been hiding it from everyone. The admission hung in the air between us. Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her throat. How much debt? I asked. $240,000. Bad investments, poor financial decisions, clients who didn't pay. It snowballed faster than I could control it. I felt a familiar heaviness in my chest, the same feeling I had experienced when sentencing young offenders whose lives had been derailed by poor choices and circumstances beyond their control. So you thought the solution was to... What exactly? What did you put in my wine? Floyd's face flushed with shame. Something I got from a client who couldn't pay his fees. He said it would cause someone to become disoriented, maybe lose consciousness for a while. I thought if you had some kind of medical episode, maybe a mild stroke or heart incident, you might decide to restructure your estate, maybe give me early access to my inheritance. The calculated coldness of his plan was breathtaking. He hadn't just intended to harm me. He had planned to use my supposed medical crisis as leverage to extract money from me. Floyd, Victoria whispered from the doorway, her voice breaking. You planned to fake a medical emergency to manipulate inheritance money? I was desperate, he said, turning toward her with pleading eyes. I didn't want to hurt him permanently. I just needed a way to access funds quickly. But you had no idea what that substance would actually do to him, Judge Harrison interjected, his voice stern. You experimented with his health based on the word of someone who gave you an unknown chemical as payment for legal services. Floyd's shoulders sagged as the full weight of his actions settled over him. I know how it sounds. I know how terrible it is. But I was out of options. The creditors were threatening everything, the house, the practice, our entire life. So you decided to threaten mine instead, I said quietly. He looked at me then with the same expression he had worn as a 12-year-old boy when he had broken something valuable and was waiting for punishment. But this wasn't a broken vase or a missed curfew. This was a betrayal that cut to the very core of everything I had believed about our relationship. I never meant for it to go this far, he whispered. When I saw you switch the glasses, I thought about stopping you. But I was too afraid of what would happen if you found out what I had done. So you drank it yourself and hoped for the best? I panicked. I didn't know what else to do. Victoria moved closer to the bed, her face a mask of devastation. Floyd, you've destroyed everything. Our marriage, your relationship with Edwin, your career. How could you think this was the answer? Because I was a coward, Floyd said simply. I was too proud to ask for help, too ashamed to admit I had failed, too weak to face the consequences of my mistakes. I sat back in my chair, processing everything he had told me. The boy I had raised with such care and attention had grown into a man capable of elaborate deception and calculated harm. But more than that, he had become someone who would rather risk destroying the people he claimed to love than admit his failures and ask for help. "What happens now?" Victoria asked, looking between Floyd and me. "Now," I said, standing up slowly. "Floyd faces the consequences of his choices. The police are investigating and there will likely be criminal charges. Beyond that," I paused, meeting Floyd's eyes directly. "Beyond that, our relationship as we've known it is over." Floyd's face crumpled, but he didn't protest. He knew, as I did, that some betrayals are too fundamental to overcome, some trust too shattered to rebuild. As I walked toward the door, I heard him call my name one last time. "Uncle Edwin?" I turned back, giving him one final look. "I really am sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I know you are, Floyd, but sorry doesn't change what you were willing to do." And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving behind 30 years of fatherhood and facing an uncertain future without the family I thought I had. A few months had passed since that terrible night at Le Bernardin, and I was finally beginning to understand what peace felt like. I stood on the deck of my new home in Asheville, North Carolina, watching the morning mist rise from the Blue Ridge Mountains, a cup of coffee warming my hands as the autumn air carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. The house was smaller than my Victorian mansion in Richmond Hill, a modest 3-bedroom cabin that I had purchased for $275,000. It sat on 5 acres of wooded land, far enough from the city to provide solitude but close enough to the town center that I could walk to the library, the courthouse where I occasionally volunteered, and the small cafe where I had become a regular. Moving here hadn't been an easy decision. For 35 years, that house in Richmond Hill had been my sanctuary, filled with memories of raising Floyd, of quiet evenings reading by the fireplace, of Sunday dinners around the mahogany table where we had shared so many conversations about his future. But after the trial, after everything that had been revealed, those memories had become too painful to bear. Floyd had been sentenced to 2 years in prison for assault with a dangerous substance. The trial had been swift and decisive. His confession at the restaurant, witnessed by dozens of respected members of the legal community, had made defending his actions impossible. His law practice had collapsed within weeks of his arrest, and Victoria had filed for divorce before the trial even began. I had attended the sentencing, sitting in the gallery as Floyd stood before Judge Martinez, a woman I had mentored early in her career. When she asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I had declined. There was nothing I could say that would capture the depth of the betrayal, nothing that would help him or anyone else understand the complexity of my feelings. The house sale had taken 3 months to finalize. I had sold it to a young family with 2 children, and seeing their excitement as they explored the rooms where Floyd had grown up had brought me both sadness and a strange sense of closure. Perhaps those walls would witness happier times, healthier relationships, children who would grow up to honor rather than exploit the love given to them. I had kept very little from my old life. Most of the furniture had been sold or donated. The law books went to the county law library. The fine china and crystal, including those red wine glasses that had played such a crucial role in my salvation, were given to Sarah Chen, who had remained a loyal friend throughout the ordeal. But I had kept a few things. The photograph of my sister Margaret, Floyd's mother, still sat on my bedside table. The carving set my father had given me when I graduated from law school remained in my kitchen drawer. And my judicial robes hung in the closet, not because I planned to wear them again, but because they represented 40 years of service I was proud of, regardless of how that service had ended. The money from the house sale, combined with my retirement savings, had given me more financial security than I had ever expected to have. My pension provided $1,800 per month, which was more than sufficient for my simple lifestyle. I had even been able to establish a scholarship fund at the law school, the Margaret Holloway Memorial Scholarship, named after my sister, designed to help students from disadvantaged backgrounds pursue legal careers. My days now followed a peaceful routine that would have seemed impossible during my years on the bench. I woke with the sunrise, made coffee, and spent an hour reading on the deck while listening to birdsong and the distant sound of a creek that ran through my property. After breakfast, I would take long walks through the mountain trails, sometimes hiking for hours without seeing another person. 3 days a week, I volunteered at the county courthouse, helping people navigate the legal system without representation. The work reminded me why I had chosen law in the first place, not for prestige or power, but to help people find justice and resolution in their struggles. I had made new friends as well. Tom and Helen Richardson, a retired couple who lived 2 miles down the mountain road, had invited me to their weekly bridge game. Martha Webb, the librarian in town, had recruited me to help with the legal clinic she ran for low-income residents every Saturday morning. Dr. Patricia Hayes, who had her practice in town, had become a hiking companion and, slowly, something more than just a friend. Patricia was 60 years old, a widow whose husband had passed away 5 years earlier from cancer. She was intelligent, kind, and had a quiet strength that reminded me of my sister Margaret. We had met at the farmer's market, where she was buying vegetables for what she later told me was a disastrous attempt at making vegetable soup. I had offered to share my own recipe, which had led to dinner at my house, which had led to many more dinners and long conversations about life, loss, and the possibility of new beginnings. "You seem lighter," she had told me one evening as we sat by my fireplace, watching the flames dance against the stone hearth I had built myself during my first month in the cabin. "Lighter? Like you're carrying less weight. When I first met you, there was something heavy in your expression, something you were always thinking about. It's gone now." She was right. The burden of responsibility I had carried for Floyd's well-being, the constant worry about his choices and his future, the guilt over whatever mistakes I might have made in raising him, all of that had finally lifted. I was no longer responsible for anyone's life but my own, and that freedom was both terrifying and liberating. I had received one letter from Floyd during his incarceration. It had arrived 3 months after the trial, forwarded by my attorney since Floyd didn't have my new address. The letter was 7 pages long, filled with apologies, explanations, and requests for forgiveness. He wrote about his regrets, his plans for rehabilitation, his hopes that we might someday reconcile. I had read it twice, then filed it away without responding. Some bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt. Some trust once broken cannot be repaired. Floyd would have to find his way forward without my guidance or support, just as I was learning to find my way forward without the identity of being his protector and provider. The most surprising aspect of my new life was how little I missed my old one. I had expected to feel lost without the structure and purpose that had defined my existence for so many decades. Instead, I felt discovered, as if I was finally meeting the man I had always been beneath the roles I had played. On this particular morning, as I stood on my deck watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah Chen's number. "Good morning, Sarah," I answered, settling into my deck chair. "Judge, Edwin, I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to let you know that Floyd was released yesterday. He served 18 months of his sentence and got early release for good behavior." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, but it passed quickly. "Thank you for letting me know." He asked me if I knew how to reach you. I told him I didn't, and that even if I did, I wouldn't share your information without your permission. "You did the right thing." There was a pause. "Edwin, he seemed different, older, quieter. He asked me to tell you that he doesn't expect forgiveness, but that he wanted you to know he's going to try to do better." I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of the morning sun on my face. "I hope he does, Sarah, for his own sake." After hanging up, I remained on the deck for a long time, processing the news of Floyd's release. I felt no anger, no fear, no desire to reach out to him. I felt only a kind of sad closure, like the end of a book I had been reading for 30 years. At noon, Patricia arrived with hiking boots and a backpack filled with sandwiches and water bottles. We planned to explore a new trail that led to a waterfall Tom Richardson had told us about. "You look peaceful today," she said, kissing my cheek as she set down her pack. "I feel peaceful," I replied, meaning it completely.